Hello and welcome back to my Pikmin review marathon where we're finally taking a look at Pikmin 3. Not just any version of Pikmin 3 though, but Pikmin 3 Deluxe for the Nintendo Switch. Now, you might think this is a little bit weird considering that when I reviewed the original two Pikmin games, I was looking at them as they were released on the Nintendo GameCube as opposed to the vastly superior Wii versions. But the thing is with that is that I do already own Pikmin 3 Deluxe on the Switch, so I figured rather than buying it again for the Wii U, I might as well just take a look at this version. Plus, this also allows me to talk about all of the additional stuff that they added in for the Switch release too. So, with all of that out of the way, let's talk about Pikmin 3 Deluxe. Upon starting the story mode of the game, which is of course the main mode, we're greeted with a difficulty selection screen. This is actually the first time the Pikmin games have had difficulty selection, and honestly, I'm not sure what I think about this. I liked how in the previous games there was just the one difficulty, and the games were balanced in the same way for everyone, starting off easy and ending with more challenging sections. However, obviously by having these easier difficulties, it opens the game up to being enjoyed by younger or more inexperienced players who might not understand some of the more complicated elements of the game. I would have gone for the hardest difficulty, which is called Ultra Spicy, but you need to finish the game on hard first in order to unlock it. So I guess we're just gonna have to settle for playing it on the hard mode. Rather than picking up where the last game left off, we instead take control of a group of brand new characters. Alph, Brittany and Charlie are from the planet Kopai, a neighbouring planet to Hocate where Olimar is from. Kopai has a severe food shortage and the inhabitants of the planet have been sending out scout ships to nearby planets to see if they contain any food supplies. But so far, there's been no luck. One day, however, a scout ship comes across a planet designated PNF 404 and it shows promising signs. A manned ship is sent to investigate, consisting of a 3-man crew. Alph, the engineer, Brittany, the botanist, and Charlie, the captain. Together they blast off to explore the newly discovered planet, only to lose control of the ship as they enter its atmosphere and become separated. We start the game playing as Charlie, who quickly comes across the yellow Pikmin, revealing to us that the planet PNF 404 is of course the same planet that Olimar has visited in the two previous games. Interestingly, this is the first Pikmin game where the red Pikmin haven't been the ones that we first encounter. This part of the game basically serves as the tutorial, teaching us the basic controls and giving us a good feel for what the game's all about. Straight away there's a couple of brand new elements here, one of which being that we now have full control over the camera by using the right analog stick. In the GameCube games you did still have manual camera control of course, but it was maybe slightly more cumbersome, with you having to press and hold the trigger button in slightly to make the camera follow which direction you are moving the cursor, or press it down all the way to make it snap behind you. This was fine and I quickly adapted to it, but being able to move the right stick feels a lot slicker and much more in line with a modern control scheme. The next new feature is a big one, and it completely changes the flow of the game. You can now lock onto enemies or interactable items and simply hold the A button to throw all of your Pikmin at your target. This allows for not only much faster attacking capabilities, but also enables you to move and attack at the same time, something which wasn't possible in the GameCube versions of Pikmin 1 and 2. While this was possible in the Wii versions due to using the Wiimote as a motion pointer and the analog stick to move, this has never been possible using a traditional controller setup, and let me tell you, this improves the game to no end. The enemies here can move around way more than in the previous games, and everything feels so much more snappy. Being able to quickly switch between targets and throw out Pikmin at loads of different things all at the same time. It's a really great quality of life improvement. You also have another new trick up your sleeve, with the ability to tell all of your Pikmin to attack all at once, and send them all running at a target in unison. Something which is useful to overwhelm enemies in combat, but it's also insanely handy for picking items up and carrying them back to your ship. If you send your Pikmin running at an item and it requires, let's say, 10 Pikmin to carry, but you send out 30 Pikmin, the other 20 Pikmin will run back to you, only leaving behind the necessary 10 Pikmin to do the lifting. This makes managing your Pikmin numbers way more efficient, and you no longer need to stand there throwing one Pikmin at a time, making sure that you don't throw over the necessary amount. It's another kind of small change, but it makes a huge difference to the overall game. We're only at the very beginning of the game, and already there's been a ton of impactful improvements made to the feel of the game. But let's leave that aside for a minute and get back to talking about the story. So after a little while of Charlie trying to find the crash site of the ship, he comes across a cave and is seemingly attacked by an unseen creature. It's at this point that we switch perspectives and take control of Alph as he wakes up from the crash. Alph quickly finds the red Pikmin and before long comes across an item called the Copad. With Pikmin 3 originally being a Wii U game, this is quite clearly supposed to replicate the Wii U gamepad, and I imagine that the map and other important information would have been displayed on this. With the Switch not having a second screen though, the Copad is basically just the pause screen. This is probably where the argument for Pikmin 3 being better on the Wii U would come into play, because in order to access the map and manage your team, you wouldn't have needed to have paused the game and you could have just have done it fluidly without interrupting the flow, just by glancing down at the gamepad. However, I really didn't mind at all having to pause the game to see this information, and it felt extremely simple and intuitive doing it on the TV as opposed to on a second screen. So I would argue that this doesn't impact the game at all. Plus, there's a whole host of other improvements that the Switch version has over the Wii U version, but we'll talk more about that later. Another small change made to Pikmin 3 is that instead of you needing to tap A to pluck Pikmin out of the ground, you can now just hold A. This seems like such an insignificant change, but considering the amount of Pikmin that sometimes need to be plucked, it's a very welcome change. You can also use the Copad to take pictures of the environment, which acts as a sort of rudimentary photo mode. It lacks a lot of the level of control that you see in some other games, but it's still a good feature, and the screenshots get saved to your Switch's photo album too, meaning that you could post them online if you really wanted to. It's not long before you encounter a new type of collectible, which are these text files left behind by someone who appears to know a lot more than you about the Pikmin. Immediately, somebody who's played the previous games will know that these notes have been left by Olimar, and I really like how they did this. It's like Olimar is this constant unseen presence guiding you along the journey, and it gives him this mystical-like quality, which is interesting because of the change in perspective from playing as him to playing as someone else who doesn't know who he is. After using the Pikmin to help you get rid of enemies and build bridges for you, you find the SS Drake, your ship that crash-landed earlier in the game. With the Drake giving your Copad a signal boost, you're able to make some brief contact with Brittany, who is somewhere nearby. Because it's getting dark though, Alph chooses to take the ship into low orbit in order to protect himself and the Pikmin he's found from the nocturnal enemies. While in the atmosphere of the planet, we're introduced to this game's survival mechanic. Like Pikmin 1, there's an overarching danger of running out of time and dying on this mysterious planet, whereas in Pikmin 1 this danger was caused by Olimar's Sue only having 30 days worth of life support. In Pikmin 3, the danger is instead of starvation due to a lack of food rations. At the start of the game, you only have 3 days worth of food, and you need to bring fruit back to the ship to not only harvest the seeds to save your home planet by growing more food, but also to create juice to use as rations. I really like this because it forces you to not only focus on the main task to progress the story, but to also dedicate time to collecting fruit in order to build up rations. It's arguably even better than the way Pikmin 1 handled this, because here you're in direct control of how much time you have remaining. Even though I do really like this though, I have to say, even on the hard difficulty, this rationing system never really got to the point of being worrying. In fact, I so quickly built up so much juice that I never really needed to even think about it running out. So maybe this is something that could have been balanced a bit better. Like maybe the fruit should have given you less juice or something, because it quickly got to the point where I never even needed to think about it. But hey, maybe the ultra spicy difficulty would have made this harder, who knows. I still like this idea in concept though, and it's way better than how in Pikmin 2 you just had infinite time and there wasn't any element of survival. Another new feature is that there's this badge system in the game that basically acts as a makeshift trophy or achievement list, giving you certain objectives to complete to effectively 100% the game. I like this quite a lot actually, because it gives you some things to aim for that you otherwise wouldn't normally think about. One day I would like to think that I'll go back and get every badge here. So at this point, the game is fundamentally the same as any of the other Pikmin games. You've got the fruit, which replaces the ship parts from Pikmin 1 or the treasure from Pikmin 2. You've got the day-by-day system returning, which forces you to be tactical on what tasks you focus on. And you've got all three of the original Pikmin types returning with the red, blue and yellow ones. Sure, you have some pretty major quality of life improvements with stuff like holding A to pluck, the photo mode, the locking on and the camera, but what is it that makes this game feel distinct? For me, there's three major things that Pikmin 3 does differently to the previous games. The first and potentially most important thing is something that you might have already picked up on, and that is that there's way more story progression here. In the first game, the story could pretty much be summed up in a sentence. Olimar crashes, repairs his ship, and goes home. Pikmin 2 had a bit more going on with the company going into debt and Louis going missing, but Pikmin 3 has way more going on. Already we've had the characters split up, with Charlie seemingly being attacked by something. We've had Alph find the ship and have to leave Brittany behind, but then when you find Brittany, you learn that a vital component of the ship is missing called the Cosmic Drive Key, and without that they can't get back to Kopai to save the planet. So even if they did manage to get all of the seeds that they need, they would still be screwed. And there's a few other big things that happen later in the game too, but I'll get more into those later in the video. Needless to say, I really like how more is going on in this game's story. It lets you get to know the characters a lot more, and by the end of it, I ended up liking the new characters just as much as I like Olimar. The one caveat to this more focused story though is that the game does end up feeling a little bit more linear than the previous games. With Pikmin 1 and 2, the main goal has always been to find the collectibles, but with Pikmin 3, the main goal is to complete a certain task, and the collectibles are more of a side objective. You still need to get all of the fruit if you want to 100% the game, of course, but it doesn't feel as essential to the experience as it did before, which makes it feel a bit less important. This is obviously a shame, because if you just wanted to experience the story and you didn't go for all of the fruit, you would be missing out on huge sections of the game, and what doesn't help this situation is that the ending hardly changes at all based on how much fruit you get. It's a weird situation because I love the new objective-based story progression, but at the same time I also think it takes away from the main gameplay style of Pikmin. Overall though, this didn't affect me personally because I'm a bit of a completionist anyway, but I can imagine that a lot of people who aren't like that might have felt like the game was short and a bit lacking in content. Because the game is more linear, it also means that the game's bosses this time are actually essential to complete in order to finish the game. This is something that wasn't always the case in the previous games. This is another negative side effect of the objective-based structure of Pikmin 3, because the game feels far less open-ended and you feel more railroaded and like you aren't really exploring on your own anymore. Another detail adding to this feeling is that after a short while, all of the fruit in the game is marked on your map. So it goes for the same sort of style as we saw in Pikmin 1, rather than like in Pikmin 2, where you were given a proximity detector to incentivize going off on your own to look for stuff, rather than following dots on a map. Getting back to the bosses though, these are actually really good. I think with you being able to lock on, throw Pikmin faster, and do the new rush attack, they were able to make the bosses a bit faster and give them more variety of attacks. The first boss is actually one of the standout ones, but in order to talk about that, we first need to talk about the new Pikmin types added into this game. I've already mentioned that red, blue and yellow Pikmin return here, all keeping their abilities from Pikmin 2, with the yellow ones still being resistant to electric. However, the purple and white Pikmin which were new to Pikmin 2 are not featured at all in the story mode here. This is an absolute travesty! How dare they get rid of my precious purple Pikmin! I'm writing a formal letter of complaint to Nintendo right now. Replacing the purple and white Pikmin are the rock Pikmin and the pink Pikmin. The rock Pikmin are kinda weird looking because as the name suggests, they look like rocks. And being rocks, they are of course used to smash things, like walls of glass or enemy armour. They also don't latch onto enemies and instead bounce off of them, but they deal a greater amount of damage than a standard Pikmin would. Overall, I like these quite a lot actually, and it leads to some interesting enemy designs that utilise armour. The pink Pikmin are again quite interesting because, unlike all of the other Pikmin, they can fly. This makes them able to get over bodies of water, meaning that the blue Pikmin are no longer the only ones that you can take into rivers or other bodies of water with you. Of course, the pink Pikmin can't go under the water, but they can carry things above the surface, and they can also lift things like doors or gates into the air, opening shortcuts or revealing hidden items to you. Again, I actually quite like these, and they're used interestingly in combat too, with them being by far the weakest type, but being good at aerial combat against tall or flying enemies. You might be wondering if there's any digging to be done in Pikmin 3, with the white Pikmin being the ones that had that ability in the second game, and yeah, there is digging. However, this isn't tied to a Pikmin type this time, and any Pikmin can do it. I guess the in-universe explanation for this is that none of the items that you dig for are fully underground this time, so it kind of fits with the lore. However, one huge plot hole here, and a universe-shattering discovery, is that bomb rocks make the grand return in Pikmin 3, but they can be picked up with any Pikmin type, and not just the yellow ones like in the first game. You know what? That's it. I'm out of here. Absolutely rubbish game. Pikmin sucks. So getting back to what I was talking about earlier with the bosses in the game. The reason that these are quite interesting is because most of them require more than one type of Pikmin to defeat, with the first boss being covered in armour, needing to have rock Pikmin thrown at it to destroy its outer shell, and then have red Pikmin thrown at its fleshy body to latch on and deal damage. It's really great stuff, and I love how the bosses and some of the bigger enemies are almost like puzzles rather than a standard enemy. It makes them a lot more memorable that way. Something I should probably bring up as well is that the way that you organise Pikmin types is better than it's ever been. In Pikmin 2 you could switch between the different colours of Pikmin by grabbing one and then using the D-pad to cycle through them. This worked and was a huge improvement to the first game, but Pikmin 3 has the edge once again because you don't even need to grab a Pikmin anymore, and you just press L and R to cycle between all of the types in your party. Then pressing A just throws whichever type is selected. It's that easy. So, we've talked about the way that the story progresses being different in Pikmin 3, but what else does it bring to the table that's new? Well, to be honest, this technically isn't a brand new feature, but it's so much more expanded and utilised here that it feels brand new. You remember how Pikmin 2 had 2 playable characters that you could switch between to solve puzzles and multitask more effectively? Well, Pikmin 3 now has 3 playable characters to switch between. Now, the additional character here isn't the big change, but rather it's how the game has been much better designed to compensate for having more characters, and there's far more moments where you actually need to use all of the characters. There was literally only maybe 3 or so puzzles in Pikmin 2 where you actually needed the second character, so really this whole mechanic felt a little bit tacked on. But here in Pikmin 3, the idea is fully developed. Not only can you now throw the other playable characters, enabling you to reach areas that you couldn't get to with only one person, but you can also way more effectively manage your team by going onto the map, telling a character to walk to a location, and then sending them on the way while you control another character and move somewhere else. Now this sounds a little bit complicated, and at first I was really worried that this would become really overwhelming, but it's actually so easy to do in practice that I was using this all the time throughout my entire playthrough, and it dramatically increased the pace of the game. You no longer need to spend ages travelling back and forth across the map or waiting for Pikmin to carry something back to the ship before you do another objective, because you can split several tasks across all of the characters. And once you've finished one task, you can instantly snap to another character in a totally different area and start a new task there. It's an amazing addition to the game, and like I say, it's implemented so much better than what it was in Pikmin 2. The final major thing that Pikmin 3 adds to the experience is more of an emphasis on level gimmicks. A constant criticism of the earlier games is that I did feel a little bit like all of the levels sort of blended into one in terms of their visual design and gameplay mechanics. Pikmin 2 addressed this a little bit with the new caves that you explore and the snowy level, but I feel like a lot more could have been done in this area. Pikmin 3 is the best game in the series so far for this, not only because the areas look slightly more distinct from another this time, but also because some of them have gimmicks or memorable objectives which aren't featured in the other levels. While the first and second levels feel very similar, these being the Tropical Wilds and the Garden of Hope, the third, fourth and fifth levels are quite different. The first two levels are kind of the standard grassy ones, although I suppose the Tropical Wilds does have a beach area to be fair, but in terms of navigation, these are about as basic as it gets. The third level, Distant Tundra, is once again a snowy level like the one from Pikmin 2. But the gimmick here is that Alph and Brittany are separated and you need to create a bridge from both sides of a cliff in order to reunite with each other. You need to use both of the Pikmin types properly in order to build the bridge together, and it ends up being a fairly memorable part of the game because by this point you've gotten used to being able to use the characters in tandem. But now that they can't actually get back together again, it changes the way that you think about traversal and what objectives you need to focus on. The best level for offering a unique method of navigation though is the fourth level, called Twilight River, which as the name implies, features a river. In order to explore this level fully, you need to jump onto these floating lily pads and then jump off at certain points to reach new areas. And then eventually you unclog another section of the river and this opens up the level even more, allowing you to visit some brand new areas. It's a great level of the game and it's probably the single most unique level in the entire series so far. The final level of the game is called the Formidable Oak, but I feel like talking about this is getting into spoiler territory. So, if you want to avoid spoilers for the story, as well as spoilers for gameplay mechanics, then skip to the time on the screen now. You've been warned. So before we talk about the Formidable Oak, it's probably best that we take a step back and talk about the events leading up to this moment. After Alph reunites with Brittany, the two have three objectives. Find more fruit to save the planet, find the cosmic drive key so that they can actually get back home at all, and find Charlie, who as we know was attacked way back at the start of the game. After a few red herrings, the two find Charlie inside the stomach of a big moth-like monster who is sensitive to light. So, using the yellow Pikmin who conduct electricity, you manage to power up a series of batteries and turn a light on, which allows you to defeat the big moth and save your captain. After this, the group discovers that Olimar is still on the planet and come to the conclusion that he must have the cosmic drive key that they need. They find a message from none other than Louis, who has gotten himself into trouble with a big enemy, but the group mistake him for Olimar and bring him onto the ship. As we know from Pikmin 2, Louis is a bit of a wild card and is obsessed with food. Unfortunately for the gang, upon waking up they discover that not only has Louis landed the ship and escaped, but he's also stolen all of the juice that you've collected over the course of the game too. Now, this is probably one of the best parts of the whole game, because this is the only time where you feel at risk of actually running out of food and starving. You need to make sure that you collect fruit at this point, because every single bit of a juice buffer that you had will be gone. This actually ends up making Louie more of an antagonist than what he was even in Pikmin 2. Yet somehow he's still partnered up with Olimar. Anyway, after finding Louie again, you get the truth out of him this time and learn that he isn't Olimar, but that the real Olimar is at the top of the formidable oak. This brings us back to the final level where you find an unconscious Olimar. You have to use the Pikmin to transport him through a huge labyrinth of a level which requires the use of every single Pikmin type. But while you do this, you're also being chased down by the final boss, the Plasm Wraith. Now, you might recall one of the most terrifying and memorable enemies from Pikmin 2, which was the Water Wraith. And this creature acted very similarly to the Plasm Wraith, in terms of relentlessly chasing you down through a complex cave system, so I can't help but think that these two creatures are probably one and the same. This thing really seems to be holding a grudge against Olimar for some reason. Either way though, just like with the Water Wraith bit from Pikmin 2, this is one of the most memorable sections of the game, and you need to multitask by not only clearing a path forward and completing several puzzles, but you also need to constantly move Olimar around because he's being targeted by the Wraith. Once you finally get near the ship, the final boss battle ensues, and you need to survive all of the Wraith's elemental attacks, while whittling its health down and making it smaller and smaller, eventually making it tiny enough to fully defeat. Olimar is then saved and he wakes up, giving you the cosmic drive key and getting a lift home on the Drake, seeing as Hokate is on the way to Kopai. Of course, Louie also hitches a ride with you, and you all blast off into space with everyone safe, all of the seeds you need to rescue Kopai, and the cosmic drive key in hand. The standard ending cutscene is actually exactly the same as the 100% ending cutscene, it's just that the text at the end is very slightly different. With the standard ending, it states that the residents of Kopai will need to carefully cultivate the seeds in order to save everyone, whereas the 100% ending text says that the seeds you've recovered will kick off a sustainable cycle of cultivation and harvesting. So basically it implies that Kopai will flourish with all of the seeds, whereas they'll still struggle a bit if you don't get all of them. An additional detail with the 100% text is that it asks the question of why the SS Drake crashed at the start of the game in the first place, implying that there was some kind of force messing with the ship. The actual ending cutscene is fairly self-explanatory, just showing the crew blast off into space. However, there is one interesting detail as we revisit the Pikmin planet and we watch as a ship crashes in the distance and the Pikmin go running towards it, maybe implying that Pikmin 4 is on its way, or maybe we'll see the aftermath of that in Hey Pikmin. One slightly disappointing thing here is that once again, there's no real unlockables. I've said this 3 videos in a row now, but it would have been awesome to have unlocked some cosmetic stuff for the crew members, enemies and the ship. Or maybe we could have unlocked the Pikmin short films to enjoy. All of these short films are available on YouTube, and all 3 of them are really great. I wish they made more of them, to be honest, because they're so good. Definitely give them a watch if you haven't already. But that basically sums up the story mode of Pikmin 3. It's really great, and it manages to combine the best elements of Pikmin 1 and 2, as well as adding in its own new features to make it feel distinct. It takes the survival element from the first game, the multiple playable characters from the second game, and puts the story more at the forefront of the experience, which I found very enjoyable. Something you've probably noticed is that Pikmin 3 is much more similar to the first game in terms of its structure, with it simply having 5 open levels to explore and find items in, rather than like in Pikmin 2 where the bulk of the game was spent in linear, randomly generated dungeons. While I did like those sections in Pikmin 2, I do feel like it relied a bit too heavily on them, so I'm glad Pikmin 3 went back to the series' roots. But of course, as we all know by now, the Pikmin games always have a few bonus modes for us to take a look at, so we're not done yet. Let's start by taking a look at probably the most interesting side mode, which is actually exclusive to the Switch Deluxe version of the game. This mode is called Side Stories and basically shows the events of the game but from Olimar and Louie's perspective. There's not as much story going on here, but it is interesting seeing Olimar visit the locations from the main game before Alph, Brittany and Charlie arrive there. We even get to see Olimar find the cosmic drive key, and it's explained that the reason him and Louie are there in the first place is to carry on looking for treasure after Hocketate Freight goes bust again. Geez, this is the second time now that this company has gone into debt. They're really bad at running a business. Another set of side stories is actually set after the ending of Pikmin 3, and it's actually a little bit anticlimactic, because if you remember that mysterious ship that was crashing in the distance at the end of Pikmin 3, well yeah, this isn't actually building up hype for Pikmin 4 or even Hey Pikmin, because we learn in this side story that the ship is actually just Olimar and Louie coming back to the planet for a fourth time now in order to retrieve their crashed ship that they left behind at the start of Pikmin 3. I really doubt that this was the original intention of that ending cutscene. It's probably just been so long of a gap between Pikmin 3 and the potential Pikmin 4 that they feel like they had to wrap it up just to bring some closure to the series for now. The question of why the SS Drake crashes at the start of the game remains unexplained though. These side story levels all fall into a set of gameplay categories. In some levels you need to defeat a certain number of enemies within a time limit, some of them have you collect all of the fruit in a time limit, and some of them have you take a ship part through a level, again in a certain time limit. There's a couple of more unique levels like this one where you need to regroup with Louie, but most of them follow one of those mission structures. Overall, I really enjoyed these side stories, to be honest. While the story itself was more in the background than what it was in the main game, it was still nice to learn what was going on with Olimar behind the scenes, as well as learn what happens after the main game too. All of the levels are far more compact than the levels from the main game, and act as a sort of remix of a section of the levels from the main game too, rather than being completely original level designs. But this actually shows just how versatile these levels can be. You even visit the Twilight River level before the water appears, which is quite interesting. The second extra mode in the game is actually the mission mode, and unlike with the side stories, these actually were featured in the original Wii U version of the game. It's just that Deluxe actually includes all of the DLC levels that were introduced to the Wii U version later on. The mission mode is actually extremely similar to the side stories in the way that it's just about completing a task like collecting fruit or defeating enemies in a time limit, but because mission mode doesn't have a story, it's not quite as engaging. I have to admit I didn't actually finish this mode because it was starting to feel a little bit repetitive at this point, but I'll definitely be going back to this later. The one mission mode type which is different to the side stories though is the defeat bosses category, which allows you to replay the bosses from the main game and see how quickly you can beat them. This is great because it means you have an easy way of playing the bosses again without needing to go through the whole game from the start. But do you want to know the best thing about this mission mode? Purple Pikmin make the return here. Rejoice, Pikmin 3 has been saved. Purple Pikmin are back. Take that letter of complaint that you wrote to Nintendo, rip it up and throw it in the bin. And I guess white Pikmin also make the return too. Then finally, the third extra mode of Pikmin 3 is the Bingo Battle mode. Like the two-player battle mode from Pikmin 2, this is Pikmin 3's version of a competitive multiplayer experience. And just like the mode from Pikmin 2, this is actually really good. It actually works a little differently to in Pikmin 2 as well, so rather than just collecting marbles dotted around the map, or attempting to steal your opponent's marble directly, you instead collect different fruits and enemies in order to fill out a bingo card which is randomized and different for each player. The objective is to get a line filled in on the bingo card in any direction, but of course the catch is that your opponent can see your card and could opt to block you from creating a line by stealing that particular fruit or enemy that you need. So it's like this situation where you might need to bluff what you're actually looking for to throw your opponent off and then go for an unexpected line. There's a variety of settings that you can tweak to give players an advantage or implement more rules, but that's basically the gist. Just like with the battle mode from Pikmin 2, I had way more fun with this than I thought I would. Now, we've talked about every single mode across the entire game at this point, and you would assume that that would mean that we're done here. However, there's one significant thing that I've not spoken about yet that's actually new to the Deluxe version as well, and that is 2-player co-op across every mode of the game. Yeah, you heard that right. Not only are the mission mode and side stories playable in co-op, but for the first time in the Pikmin series, the actual main story mode is playable in co-op too. Now, don't get me wrong, just like with the mission mode in Pikmin 2, which was playable in co-op, I still think that this maybe could have been implemented slightly better. Like, it still feels a bit like you're constantly fighting over which Pikmin belong to who, and I feel like there should have been a way of making a certain person's Pikmin unable to be controlled by the other player or something. But having said that, the co-op in Pikmin 3 works way better, simply because it's designed much more heavily around splitting up and multitasking. I've wanted a Pikmin game to fully embrace co-op literally since I played the first game, so I'm so happy to finally see it here. Awesome stuff. You might have noticed that I've not really talked about too many negative things with this game, and this is normally the point in the video where I would say something like, oh well, let's talk about all of the things that I didn't like. But I'm actually not gonna do that. There's nothing else bad to say. This is a seriously amazing game, and its flaws are so minor that they hardly matter at all. This is one of the best games available on the Switch, and it's so incredibly underrated and underappreciated that it's a crime. To no one's surprise, I'm putting Pikmin 3 Deluxe in first place in my series ranking. For me, it's quite clearly the best game in the series, and honestly, it's kind of made me want a remake of Pikmin 1 and 2, but with all of the improvements that Pikmin 3 Deluxe has made. I know a lot of people would definitely be rolling their eyes at that, and obviously I would prefer a brand new game in the form of Pikmin 4, but I'm just saying, I would be down for Pikmin 1 and 2 Deluxe. The only real negatives with Pikmin 3 are that you could argue that the emphasis on story takes away from the elements of exploration. You could say it was a bit too easy and you get given way too much juice from the fruit. You could say that the co-op could have been maybe slightly better in the way that you could have had your own set Pikmin. And I feel like you could have unlocked more stuff like cosmetics or the Pikmin short films. Also, the ending is a little bit disappointing because you don't actually even get to see Kopai, and it kinda just feels a little bit abrupt. But with how great the rest of the game is, these things are so easily overlooked. This is the definitive Pikmin experience, and it pretty much improves on every single aspect from the other games. The combat is better, with you being able to lock on and attack with all of your Pikmin with the touch of a button. The exploration is fast-paced and fluid, with the way that you can separate the group and still maintain a degree of control over the movement. The graphics are obviously the best the series has seen, with it being on way more modern hardware. The extra modes offer an absolute ton of additional content on top of the main game. It's all playable in co-op. The quality of life improvements are through the roof, even with stuff I've not had the time to talk about, like the fact that all of the onion types combine into one single onion, making it easier to get all of your Pikmin out at the start of the day. There's just so much to love here that it's ridiculous. Obviously, on top of all of this, there's also a ton of improvements made to the Wii U version of the game that I've not mentioned as well. Like the return of the Piclopedia from Pikmin 2, which lets you look at a description of all of the enemies and objects in the game, written by each of the 5 main characters, and way more on top of this too. To sum Pikmin 3 Deluxe up in a word, amazing. And that wraps up my thoughts on Pikmin 3 Deluxe. Going into this, I did think that I was gonna like it, but I didn't think I was gonna love it anywhere near as much as I did. Don't get me wrong though, I do still have a soft spot for Pikmin 1, I just like how that one's a little bit shorter and more arcade-like. but it's hard to deny that Pikmin 3 is the overall best in the series, and the most well-rounded too. It's absolute insanity that more people aren't talking about this, and that there's not been a fourth main entry in the series yet either. As you know though, we aren't quite done with this Pikmin marathon yet though, because we've got one final game left to talk about with Hey Pikmin, which was released on the 3DS in 2017. Technically making it the newest game in the entire series, considering that Pikmin 3 originally came out in 2013. And yeah, before you rush into the comments, I do know about Pikmin Bloom, but I don't think I'm actually gonna cover that with a review. The reason for this is that I've been playing it a little bit, and it basically just seems like it's a step counter with a few other bells and whistles attached to it. I don't know if I would really consider it to be a game. So, at least for now, I'm considering Hey Pikmin to be the final proper Pikmin game. So, join me next time where we're taking a look at this. Give the video a like if you enjoyed it, subscribe to see more stuff like this coming soon, and leave a comment down below letting me know if you picked up Pikmin 3 Deluxe and what you thought of it. And until next time, bye!